So we're going to turn now to the slide, All Politics is Collective Action. And this is one of those 5 principles of politics that we see on an earlier slide. And what this basically means is that politicians need to work together to achieve their goals. No one can do politics alone, right? Even if you think about Hobbes's Leviathan, the sort of single dictatorial ruler, he's not doing politics alone. He's not running the country alone. He might be the man in charge, but he's going to have people working for him, right? He can't possibly enforce all the laws on his own. He's going to have to delegate that power. He's going to have people working with him and for him to do this. So all politicians must work together to achieve their goals. The thing is this can cause problems because collective action is not always easy. And collective action can result in many different problems. One of those problems is the tragedy of the commons. This is the idea that costless consumption of a common good can lead to its ruination. It's okay if some of those terms sound very technical and you're not familiar with them yet. We will talk about them more as the semester goes on. I'm just going to give you a little preview right now. What this basically means is there are things that we sometimes want to use and we can't, but if we all use it, it could ruin it. So, for example, let's say you are a cattle rancher, and that's probably a slightly obscure example, but it's a classic one, first written out by Garrett Hardin, who discusses the tragedy of the commons in a relatively famous paper of his. So we're going to use that example. So imagine, if you will, you are a cattle rancher, and you have a whole bunch of cattle, say 100 head of cattle, and you graze them on this nice, big, grassy field. And they eat it, and that's good, but there's not so many of them that they eat all the grass before it is time to grow back. So you're happy. Let's say your neighbor's also a cattle rancher, and they also have 100 head of cattle, and they graze their cattle on that same land. And what's great is your 100 head of cattle and their 100 head of cattle don't overuse the land. 200 cattle eat grass, but not so quickly that it can't regrow in time. Yay, everything's good. But you think, well, wouldn't it be better if I had more cows, right? Because then I'd make more money. So you decide to add another 10 head of cattle to your herd. Now you have 10 more cattle than your neighbor. So you're not only going to be making more money, you're going to be beating them, which generally is human nature, quite satisfying. So you're all good. But now your neighbor, who is also very rational just meaning motivated to maximize their utility to get the most out of anything, or the best possible outcome, they add 10 cattle. So now you've both added 10 cattle. So now you have 220 head of cattle. Things are going okay, but the grass is starting to look a little worn. But it's still okay. So you add another 10 head of cattle. Things are okay still. It's looking like they're using up the grass a little bit more quickly than it can regrow, but it's basically fine. Now your neighbor adds another 10 heads. All of a sudden, we're starting to overeat too. The grass, it's not reproducing as quickly as we need it to. It's not regrowing. So now we have 240 head of cattle and no grass. So now all our cows die. Definitely not an optimal solution, right? So what we've basically illustrated is a tragedy of the commons. Overconsumption of this common good, the grassland, has led to its ultimate ruination, that the grass is now all eaten up and trampled and dead, and we can't support our cattle anymore. So what do we do? And that is the dilemma in a tragedy of the commons. Oftentimes, what happens is we make institutions. Institutions can solve these kind of problems. In this case, maybe the federal government steps in and makes these grazing lands federal property and then requires you to get a license to have your cattle on the land. and tells you when you apply for this license what the maximum number of cattle you can have on that land is, right? So that maximum number is your limit, and the government knows how many cattle are on the land at any given time and whether the land can support that or not. It's great. We've avoided the tragedy of the commons by allowing an institution, the government, to regulate these things. Now, in this case, that would be, in essence, jurisdiction. They have jurisdiction over this land now. The land is no longer common land, it's government land that they control. They also have decisiveness in that they can set the rules. They ultimately say 200 head of cattle and no more, right? They're decisive. So we're going to look this semester quite a bit at collective action problems like the tragedy of the commons, but also other collective action problems, which we will illustrate throughout the semester, and how we can solve them using institutions, and how institutional structure uses certain tools like jurisdiction and decisiveness, as well as these others here, in order to help get us out of collective action problems and ensure that collective action doesn't become problematic in the first place. So that is going to be a major theme this semester.